Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Home Secretary for advance sight of her statement and welcome her agreement to establish an independent inquiry. But that inquiry must get to the truth, and it should do so considerably more rapidly than January. Reports have already reached me from the Borders Agency today that the shredders are on and there is a ban on internal emails. Can she look urgently into those allegations and into what documents might be being shredded and what emails might be being deleted in both the Home Office and the UKBA on this issue? It's also important that the inquiry must have access to all communications between ministers, the Home Office and the Borders Agency on this issue. And the scope must also cover the resource pressures facing UKBA. We now know that 6,500 staff are being cut from the Borders Agency, including 1,500 from the Borders Force, and we need to know what pressures officials were put under to cut corners as a result to keep queues down with reduced staff. We also need some answers from the Home Secretary now. In questions earlier and in her statement now, the Home Secretary could not tell the House how many people came through our ports and our airports this summer without proper checks. 100,000 foreign citizens, on average, enter Britain every day. The Borders Agency staff have claimed that the reduced checks were in place almost daily since August and lasting at least half of the shift. So how many people weren't checked against the watch list? How many people did not have their biometrics checked? What is her estimate of whether anyone from the watch list will have entered Britain at that time? Did any convicted criminals or security suspects enter? The truth is, the Home Secretary does not know. She says, we will never know. She seems instead to be simply doing nothing even now to find out and assess who has entered the country and what the security risk might be. Mr. Speaker, the Home Secretary has admitted that she took the decision to reduce checks for EU citizens in July, not checking under 18s against the warnings index, not doing biometric checks on EU passports, yet she will know cases have been identified by Borders officials involving EU citizens, including people involved in organised crime, people trafficking, falsifying passports or removals of children who are wards of court. She made that decision, not Labour ministers in the past, this Home Secretary, and that decision is her responsibility. She cannot run away from it or hide behind cases from 2004, long before new systems were put in. She knows that the intention of Labour, and we had assumed Conservative ministers, was to roll out e-borders and to put the technology in place so that in future everyone could be properly screened entering and exiting the country. Not just everyone at quiet times. In fact, the Immigration Minister claimed in May that 90% of non-EU flights were covered and 60% of EU flights. It turns out they only meant 90% of flights in the winter or quiet times in the afternoon. The truth is that instead of strengthening the checks year on year, as all previous ministers had committed to do, this Home Secretary decided to water them down as official government policy, even though she never told this House. She has blamed officials for relaxing the checks further than she intended, yet she gave the green light for the weaker controls. She claims in her statement that she didn't intend for it to be routine not to check the biometric chip in the EEA passports. Yet I have a copy of the interim operational instruction that she has refused to publish, and it says, we will cease routinely opening the chip within EEA passports, checking all EEA nationals under 18 against the warnings index, and then indeed it adds, if for whatever reason it is considered necessary to take further measures, local managers must escalate to the Border Force Duty Director to seek authority for their proposed action. So she gave them the green light to go ahead and experiment to meet the pressures from queues. And look how far they went. Borders Agency staff are saying, and I quote from this morning, every day I let in 10 people who I think there would be a good case against. How on earth did ministers not know about this? How on earth could there be continual complaints from staff for months and yet neither the Immigration Minister nor the Home Secretary knew what on earth was going on? At best, they were deeply out of touch. At worst, they were complicit in a loss of control at our borders. Mr. Speaker, this Home Secretary is presiding over growing chaos and corner-cutting at our borders. Raed Saleh banned from this country by the Home Office and allowed just to waltz in at Heathrow, 100,000 asylum cases written off as just too difficult to deal with, and now a green light to experiment with watering down rather than increasing border controls given by ministers. And she doesn't even know how many people entered Britain without proper checks this summer. Thousands of people have entered without proper checks and without the Home Secretary having a clue what was going on. It is no good blaming the previous government. It's no good blaming officials. This is her watch. These are her decisions and her government's mistake. She needs to get a grip and stop passing the buck.
The Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I must say that I regret that response from the Right Honourable Lady. There is no more serious issue than border security. But instead of engaging properly with the facts, she has chosen to play party politics. She knows that the checks that I approved and the relaxation of checks I did not approve are two very different matters. So let me take her points in turn. She alleges that the pilot scheme and the unauthorised actions were the result of cuts. I explained the basis for the pilot scheme in my statement. But I would remind the Right Honourable Lady that the last government was planning to cut the UK Border Agency. And in opposition, it remains the stated policy of the party opposite to cut the Home Office budget. She mentioned in passing that the House hadn't been informed of the pilot programme. It's never been the policy of any government to notify the House of operational matters such as these. Her own government did not notify the House when it introduced a risk-based warnings index policy, and it didn't notify the House when it let passengers through Heathrow without even looking at their passports. She suggests that the problems was not unauthorised official actions, but the measures we piloted in July. Let me remind the House again, as I said in my statement, these measures allowed greater intelligence-led checks to be made against higher-risk passengers. Now, does the Right Honourable Lady think that that was wrong? And if she does, why did the last government introduce a warnings index policy that allowed risk-based checks back in 2007? And let me just remind her of what I said. The pilot allowed officials in limited circumstances to use their discretion whether to check the biometric chip of EEA nationals and whether to run EEA nationals' children travelling in family groups or in school groups against the warnings index. Under her government, in similar circumstances, adults were not run against the warnings index, and on at least one occasion at Heathrow, the border was opened up so no checks were made against inbound passengers. And she says that officials at UKBA are telling her that they were suspicious about individuals, but they were being let through. It was clear in the guidance on the policy that any EEA national or EEA national child against whom suspicion was felt, then the officer should do the necessary biometric chip checks or warnings index checks. She asked whether asked about the inquiry including the decisions of ministers as well as officials. I've already said I'm happy for John Vine's investigation to look at what decisions were taken by ministers and when. She asked about the publication of paperwork between ministers and officials, and will certainly make available all relevant paperwork to the investigations. And I can assure her and the House that the paperwork will show without ambiguity that the relaxation of checks that occurred was not sanctioned by me. She asked whether any dangerous individuals had managed to come to Britain, and it is a very very serious issue. And that's why I did address this in my statement, and I made clear to the House that we are not in a position to be able to say how many people entered who should have been prevented after being flagged by the warnings index. But we would have known if anybody had tried to enter the country during the pilot, as the pilot was due to operate, because all adults were run past the warnings index and all non-EEA passengers were checked against the warnings index, and it was only EEA national children travelling with their parents on a school group that were not automatically run against the warnings index, and this is more stringent than the controls put in place by the last government, who in similar circumstances did not check all adults against the warnings index. I have said on a number of occasions, Mr. Speaker, that there is nothing more important than the security of our border, and I made clear in my statement the changes, the measures we're taking to address the lapse. In addition, we're reforming every route to the UK to reduce net migration. We're clearing the asylum backlog. We're improving removals. We're addressing the problem of Article 8, and we're creating a border policing command in our National Crime Agency to improve our border security in the long term. But I will take no lectures from the party that gave us total net migration of more than 2.2 million people. The foreign national prisoners scandal, Sangat, widespread abuse of student visas, the botched e-borders contract, a 450,000 asylum backlog, no transitional controls for Eastern Europeans, the Human Rights Act and a points-based system that failed to reduce immigration. My task now is to make sure that those responsible for this lapse are properly dealt with, and to make sure that Border Force officials can never take these risks with border security again, and that is what I am determined to do.